All right, if you're watching this alone in the dark, you're either really brave or you forgot to turn the lights on. Either way, welcome to Tales Nameless, where true horror stories creep through your headphones and linger in the corners of your mind. So, before the shadows get a little too close, hit that subscribe button. It's the only thing that keeps them away. Or, so I've heard. Welcome to the darkness. You're in the right place. If you're the type to wander into the woods alone at night, you might want to rethink that habit. Forests hold secrets. Some are ancient, whispered through rustling leaves and creaking branches, and some are much more recent, like the chilling stories I'm about to share with you tonight. These are true accounts from those brave enough, or perhaps foolish enough, to wander into the cursed woods, only to encounter something that defies reason. If you think the woods are empty at night, I promise you, you're wrong. The first story comes from a man named Andrew, a seasoned hiker who had always felt a deep connection to nature. One summer, he decided to tackle a lesser-known trail deep within the Adirondack Mountains in upstate New York. It was a path that even the locals avoided, known for its dense pines and whispering winds, where the air seemed to hang heavier, as if the trees themselves held their breath. As Andrew set off, the sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the forest floor. The trail was narrow, overgrown, and twisted like the gnarled branches overhead. Despite the unnerving quiet, he felt oddly at peace, the only sounds being his boots crunching leaves and the occasional rustle of wildlife. But as the daylight faded, he began to notice something strange. The forest around him grew eerily silent. The birds stopped singing, and the wind that had been rustling through the branches seemed to die. His steps felt louder, almost intrusive, as if he were interrupting something. He paused to catch his breath, the air suddenly feeling colder. It was then that he saw it, a small figure standing among the pines, perhaps 50 feet off the trail. It was a girl, no older than 8 or 9, with long dark hair hanging in front of her face. She wore a pale, almost translucent white dress that fluttered in a breeze he couldn't feel. She didn't move, didn't even seem to breathe, just stood there, her head slightly tilted as if listening for something. Andrew froze, his heart pounding. The rational part of his mind told him it was just a lost child, maybe part of a family camping nearby. But the deeper, more primal part of his brain screamed at him that something was wrong, that she didn't belong here. He called out, his voice thin and nervous. "Hey, are you okay? Are you lost?" The girl didn't respond. She just continued to stare, head tilted, as if his words were being absorbed by the trees themselves. Andrew took a hesitant step forward, his boots crunching loudly against the dry leaves, echoing in the stillness. Then she moved. It wasn't a normal, human movement. She seemed to glide backwards into the shadows, her feet not touching the ground, her dress swaying like a ghostly curtain. Within seconds, she had disappeared behind a dense thicket of pines, the darkness swallowing her whole. Andrew's blood ran cold. He stumbled backward, the branches scraping against his arms as he whipped his head around, trying to find a rational explanation. His mind raced. Was it a trick of the light? A prank? But no, there had been something too real, too immediate about the girl. He turned and ran, his heart pounding so loudly he could hear it in his ears. Branches whipped at his face, the forest around him a blur of dark greens and twisting shadows. He tripped twice, once slamming his shoulder into a tree, but he didn't stop. The path seemed to stretch endlessly before him, every twisted root and overgrown branch conspiring to slow his escape. When he finally burst out onto the gravel trailhead where he had parked his car, he collapsed against the hood, gasping for breath. He twisted around, expecting to see the girl standing just at the edge of the trees, her dark hair hanging like a curtain over her face. But the forest was empty, the pines swaying gently in the wind that had mysteriously returned. Days passed, but the image of the girl haunted his thoughts. He found himself obsessively reading about local legends, searching forums for similar sightings. He learned about the old logging town that once thrived in the heart of the Adirondacks, now long forgotten. Its residents said to have vanished overnight, leaving only whispers in the trees. One night, unable to sleep, Andrew decided to review the photos and videos he had taken during his hike. He hoped to convince himself that the encounter had just been a trick of the light, his mind playing games with shadows. But as he scrolled through the images, his breath caught in his throat. In one of the pictures, taken just before he had seen the girl, there was a faint, ghostly shape among the trees. It was her, the dark-haired girl, her face turned toward the camera, her head still tilted, eyes just visible beneath the curtain of hair. His heart raced. He zoomed in, his hands shaking. The face was pale, almost featureless. But the eyes, they seemed to stare straight through the screen, empty and hollow, like the sockets of a long-buried skull. Andrew deleted the photo, his finger trembling over the screen. But even as the image disappeared, he felt her presence, as if she had somehow slipped into his world, crossing the boundary between the shadows of the forest and the safety of his home. Now, whenever he walks past a darkened window or glances into a shadowed corner, he feels those hollow eyes watching him, waiting for the moment he dares to step back into the pines. If you enjoyed this story, let me know in the comments below. Have you ever felt like something was watching you from the shadows? Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Tales Nameless for more chilling tales like this one. Until next time, stay safe and keep your lights on. Story 2. The Campfire Whispers. It was a summer camping trip deep in the forest of Oregon, the kind of trip meant to be filled with laughter, ghost stories, and the warm glow of a crackling fire. But for Jake and his friends, it became a night they would never forget. They had set up their tents in a clearing surrounded by towering pines, the canopy so dense that even at noon, only thin shafts of sunlight broke through. As the day gave way to evening, they gathered around the fire, the air thick with the smoky aroma of burning logs and the earthy scent of damp soil. The fire crackled and spat, sending sparks spiraling into the darkening sky, as if the flames themselves were trying to warn them. As they shared beers and roasted marshmallows, the conversation naturally turned to ghost stories. Jake, always the bravest of the group, leaned in close to the firelight, his face lit with an eerie orange glow. He began to tell them about the legend of the Whispering Pines, a stretch of forest known for its strange, echoing voices that were said to follow unwelcome intruders. People say the trees themselves remember the voices of those who never came back, Jake said, his voice low and steady, his eyes reflecting the firelight. If you stand still long enough, you'll hear them. whispers in the wind, like the dead trying to speak through the rustling branches. They all laughed, but it was a nervous, forced sound, the kind of laughter that hangs in the air just a little too long. As the fire crackled and the night deepened, the air grew colder. Their breath came out in misty puffs, visible even in the dim firelight. The forest around them seemed to close in, the trees leaning closer as if straining to hear their conversation. Then, the whispers started. At first, they thought it was just the wind, the trees rustling as the night air cooled. But the sound grew clearer, more distinct. It was a soft, murmuring noise, like a dozen voices speaking just out of earshot, their words unintelligible but filled with a sense of urgency. Megan, the youngest in the group, hugged her knees closer to her chest. "Did you guys hear that?" Jake's smile faltered, his bravado slipping. He glanced over his shoulder, the fire casting flickering shadows that seemed to twist and dance among the trees. "It's just the wind," he said, his voice lacking its usual confidence. "Nothing to worry about." But the whispers grew louder, closer, until they felt like cold breath against the back of their necks. The fire popped loudly, sending a burst of sparks into the air, and they all flinched. Then came the footsteps, slow, deliberate, crunching over the dry leaves just beyond the circle of firelight. Jake swung his flashlight into the darkness, the beam cutting through the shadows like a blade. But there was nothing, just trees, shadows, and the pale, gnarled roots that snaked across the forest floor. "Who's out there?" Jake called, his voice echoing off the trees. "Quit messing with us." Silence. The whispers stopped. The forest held its breath. Then, without warning, the fire seemed to dim, the flames shrinking, their crackling reduced to a soft hiss, as if someone had turned down the volume of the entire world. The darkness pressed in, thick and suffocating, the air growing colder by the second. They huddled closer, their breaths coming in short, panicked gasps. Someone, it might have been Megan, let out a small, terrified whimper. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the darkness lifted. The fire roared back to life, the flames leaping higher, casting wild, dancing shadows against the trees. The whispers were gone, replaced by the steady chirping of crickets and the distant rustle of branches swaying in the breeze. Jake lowered his flashlight, his hands shaking. He turned to his friends, his face pale, his eyes wide with fear. "We need to leave. Now." They didn't argue. They packed up their gear in a frenzy, shoving sleeping bags into backpacks, dousing the fire with the last of their water, the steam hissing as it hit the hot embers. They stumbled through the dark forest, their flashlights casting frantic beams of light that seemed to bounce off every twisted branch and gnarled root. They reached their cars just as the first hints of dawn broke through the trees, the sky tinged with a sickly, pre-dawn gray. They drove away without looking back, their tires kicking up gravel as they sped down the winding mountain road, the whispers still echoing in their minds. Jake swore he would never set foot in those woods again. He still hears the whispers sometimes, late at night, when the wind rustles through the trees outside his window. He never talks about that night, but his friends know, they all know, that something followed them out of those woods. Something that still whispers, even now, waiting for them to come back. If you enjoyed this story, let me know in the comments below. Have you ever heard something you couldn't explain while camping in the woods? Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Tales Nameless for more chilling tales like this one. Until next time, stay safe and keep your lights on. Story 3: The Old Man in the Woods. When Ethan decided to spend a quiet weekend hunting alone in the dense forest of the Pacific Northwest, he expected solitude and the calming stillness of nature. What he found instead was something that would haunt him forever. Ethan had always been an experienced hunter. He thrived on the quiet, the patience, the slow rhythm of the wilderness. But that weekend, the air felt different, heavier, almost suffocating, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. He set up camp in a small clearing by a winding creek, the gentle sound of water trickling over smooth stones helping him relax. The first night passed without incident, the crackling fire casting flickering shadows that danced among the towering firs. The next morning, he set out before dawn, his rifle slung over his shoulder, his boots crunching against the thick carpet of pine needles. The air was crisp, each breath forming a thin mist that hung in the cold morning air. He moved slowly, carefully, each step calculated, his senses attuned to the slightest rustle of leaves or snap of a twig. After hours of tracking a set of fresh deer prints, Ethan paused near a small, overgrown trail that seemed to disappear into the shadows. He knelt down, examining the tracks, noting the fresh droppings and the slight disturbance in the soil, a sure sign the deer had passed through recently. He raised his head, scanning the dense thicket ahead, when he saw him. About 50 yards away, partially obscured by the thick brush, stood an old man. His clothes were ragged, hanging off his thin frame like a forgotten scarecrow, and his head was tilted slightly, his face hidden beneath the wide brim of a battered, dirt-streaked hat. He stood perfectly still, one hand gripping a twisted wooden staff, the other hanging limply at his side. Ethan froze, his heart skipping a beat. He hadn't seen another person for miles, and this man seemed to have materialized out of nowhere. He slowly raised his hand, offering a cautious wave. "Morning," he called, his voice sounding strange in the stillness. The old man didn't respond. He didn't even seem to acknowledge Ethan's presence. He just stood there, his head tilted, the brim of his hat casting a dark shadow over his face. Ethan felt a chill run down his spine. He tightened his grip on his rifle, the cold metal reassuring in his gloved hands. He took a step back, his boots sinking into the soft earth with a wet, muffled crunch. The old man's head twitched slightly, as if hearing the sound. Then, without a word, he turned and disappeared into the dense underbrush, his twisted staff dragging against the ground, the dry leaves crackling beneath his feet. Ethan let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. He stood there for a moment, his heart hammering in his chest, before turning and making his way back to camp, constantly glancing over his shoulder. That night, as he sat by the fire, the flames casting long, flickering shadows against the trees, Ethan couldn't shake the image of the old man. His mind raced with questions. Who was he? Why hadn't he said anything? And how had he moved so silently through the dense underbrush? As the hours passed, the fire crackled and hissed, the occasional pop sending a shower of sparks into the cool night air. Ethan stared into the flames, trying to push the encounter from his mind. But then, just as he was beginning to relax, he heard it. The slow, deliberate crunch of footsteps just beyond the firelight. He whipped his head around, his eyes straining to see through the darkness. The trees stood tall and silent, their branches swaying gently in the night breeze. But the footsteps continued, slow and deliberate, circling the camp, moving from tree to tree. "Who's there?" he called, his voice trembling, the echo of his words swallowed by the dense forest. The footsteps stopped. For a long, breathless moment, there was only the crackling of the fire and the whisper of the wind through the trees. Then, from somewhere deep in the darkness, a low, rasping voice broke the silence. "Go home." Ethan's blood ran cold. He stumbled to his feet, his rifle clutched tightly in his hands, his heart pounding so loudly he thought it might burst from his chest. "Show yourself," he shouted, his voice cracking with fear. But the only response was the creaking of branches and the distant rustle of leaves. He didn't sleep that night. He sat by the fire, his back to a large tree, his rifle resting on his lap, his eyes darting from shadow to shadow, every crack of a branch or rustle of leaves setting his nerves on edge. At the first light of dawn, Ethan broke camp, shoving his gear into his backpack with shaking hands. He left the fire pit smoldering, the faint wisps of smoke rising into the cold morning air. He didn't look back as he hiked out, his pace quick, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. When he finally reached his truck, he threw his gear into the bed, climbed into the cab, and slammed the door shut, his hands trembling as he fumbled with the keys. He sped down the winding forest road, the tires kicking up gravel, the trees blurring into a dark, twisted tunnel of green. Ethan never returned to those woods. He sold his rifle, gave away his hunting gear, and moved to a small apartment in the city, far from the whispering trees and the shadows that seemed to reach for him in the night. But sometimes, when the wind howls through the alleys and the shadows stretch long across the pavement, he swears he can still hear that voice, a low, rasping whisper echoing through the darkness, calling him back to the woods. If you enjoyed this story, let me know in the comments below. Have you ever felt like you weren't alone in the woods? Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Tales Nameless for more chilling tales like this one. Until next time, stay safe and keep your lights on. Story 4. The Lights in the Trees. It was supposed to be a relaxing hiking trip for Sarah and Mark, a chance to escape the noise of the city and reconnect with nature. They had chosen a remote trail deep in the Appalachian Mountains, a place known for its rugged beauty and dense, ancient forests. They set up camp in a small clearing, their tent pitched beneath towering pines, the air thick with the earthy scent of moss and damp soil. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the shadows stretched long, the forest growing darker and quieter with each passing moment. Their campfire crackled, sending flickering shadows dancing across the trunks of nearby trees. Sarah leaned against Mark, the warmth of the fire comforting in the cool mountain air. They shared stories, their laughter echoing through the dense woods, blending with the distant call of an owl and the rustle of small animals moving through the underbrush. As the night deepened, the fire burned lower, casting a softer, more eerie glow. It was then that they noticed it, a faint, bluish light flickering through the trees about 100 yards away, just past the edge of their camp. It pulsed gently, like the slow, steady rhythm of a heartbeat, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch and twist as if reaching for them. Mark squinted, leaning forward. "You see that?" Sarah nodded, her heart beginning to race. "Yeah, what is that? Someone else camping out here?" Mark shook his head. They had seen no other cars at the trailhead, no signs of other hikers. They had chosen this spot specifically for its isolation. "Maybe it's someone with a flashlight," Sarah whispered, her voice tinged with unease. But as they watched, the light grew brighter, splitting into several smaller orbs that drifted slowly through the trees, weaving in and out of the dense trunks, moving closer. The air around them grew colder, their breath misting in the firelight despite the warm embers. Mark grabbed his flashlight and stood, his eyes never leaving the lights. He clicked it on, the bright beam cutting through the darkness, slicing across the rough bark of the trees. But the lights remained unaffected, their eerie glow undiminished. "What the hell?" Mark muttered, taking a cautious step toward the edge of their camp. Sarah reached out, grabbing his arm. "Don't. We don't know what that is." But Mark pulled away, curiosity and fear mingling in his eyes. He stepped into the shadows, his flashlight flickering as if the batteries were suddenly drained. He slapped the side of it, the beam flickering weakly before cutting out entirely. "Damn it," he whispered, his voice sounding small in the vastness of the dark forest. The lights continued to drift closer, moving in slow, deliberate patterns, almost like they were searching for something. One of the orbs drifted within a few yards of Mark, its light casting his shadow long and twisted against the trees. He felt a cold, tingling sensation spread across his skin, like icy fingers tracing his spine. "Mark, come back," Sarah whispered urgently, her heart pounding in her chest. She fumbled for her phone, hoping to catch some light, but the screen stayed dark, refusing to power on. The lights suddenly paused, hanging in the air, their bluish glow casting an unnatural, ghostly light across the forest floor. Mark took a step back, his breath coming in short, panicked bursts. Then, without warning, the lights shot forward, weaving around him, circling him like a pack of predators closing in on wounded prey. They moved faster now, darting back and forth, their glow flickering like a dying bulb. Mark stumbled back, his foot catching on a tree root, sending him sprawling to the ground. He tried to scramble to his feet, his hands clawing at the damp earth, but the lights closed in, their cold glow bathing his face in a harsh, unnatural light. Sarah screamed, rushing to his side, her hand grasping for his in the darkness. But as her fingers found his, the lights suddenly blinked out, plunging them into complete darkness. For a long moment, the only sound was their ragged breathing, their hearts pounding loudly enough to echo in their ears. Then, slowly, the forest around them came back to life. The distant rustle of leaves, the soft chirping of crickets, the creak of branches swaying in the wind. Mark staggered to his feet, his hands shaking, his eyes wide with terror. He grabbed Sarah's arm, pulling her back toward the campfire, the faint glow of the dying embers, their only guide through the suffocating darkness. They sat by the fire, their bodies pressed close, their eyes darting to the edge of the camp, watching for any sign of the lights. But the woods remained still, the trees silent, the shadows long and empty. They didn't sleep that night. As the first light of dawn broke through the trees, they packed up their gear in silence, their faces pale, their hands trembling. They hiked out of the woods without looking back, their eyes constantly scanning the trees, their hearts still racing. They never spoke of that night again. But sometimes, when Sarah lies awake in the dark, she swears she can still see the faint, bluish glow of the lights drifting through the shadows outside her window, moving closer with each flicker, each pulse, each whisper of the wind. If you enjoyed this story, let me know in the comments below. Have you ever seen something in the woods that you couldn't explain? Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Tales Nameless for more chilling tales like this one. Until next time, stay safe and keep your lights on. Story 5. The Screaming Grove, 1,200 words. There's a place in the heart of the Black Hills where the trees are twisted, their branches like skeletal fingers reaching for the sky. The locals call it the Screaming Grove, a place where the wind never blows and the air is always thick, heavy with the weight of forgotten voices. Jenna had heard the stories growing up. She remembered her grandfather's voice, rough and gravelly, warning her to stay away from the grove. He used to say it was a place where the dead lingered, their souls trapped among the roots and branches, their screams echoing through the twisted trees. But Jenna, like most teenagers, had brushed off the tales as nothing more than local folklore, campfire stories meant to scare kids into staying close to home. But now, years later, she found herself standing at the edge of the grove, the thick, gnarled branches casting long, jagged shadows across the forest floor. She had come back to her childhood hometown for the first time in nearly a decade, hoping to reconnect with old friends and relive some of her best memories. But when she heard that the old grove was still standing, still untouched, still feared, curiosity got the better of her. The air was different here, thicker, heavier, as if the trees themselves were watching her. She took a deep breath, the cool, damp air filling her lungs, the faint scent of decaying leaves and damp earth clinging to the back of her throat. She stepped forward, her boots sinking into the soft, moss-covered ground, the branches overhead creaking as if whispering her name. As she ventured deeper into the grove, the sounds of the outside world faded. The distant hum of passing cars and the chirping of birds swallowed by the dense, suffocating silence. She paused, her heart beginning to race, her skin prickling with an uneasy electric sensation. The twisted trees loomed above her, their branches twisted into grotesque, unnatural shapes, their bark rough and gnarled, like the twisted faces of the damned. Jenna pressed on, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps, her footsteps muffled by the thick carpet of fallen leaves. The air grew colder, her breath forming thin, wispy clouds that hung in the still air, refusing to dissipate. She reached a small clearing, the twisted trees forming a natural circle around a patch of bare, dark earth. She paused, her heart hammering in her chest, her eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. That's when she heard it, a faint, distant whisper, like the rustling of dead leaves caught in a forgotten wind. It came from all around her, the voices blending together into a low, mournful wail, the sound seeming to rise from the very ground beneath her feet. "Help us!" Jenna's blood ran cold. She spun around, her eyes wide, her heart pounding so loudly she thought it might burst from her chest. The twisted branches seemed to close in around her, the shadows growing darker, thicker, as if the trees themselves were leaning closer. their gnarled limbs stretching toward her. "Help us!" The voices grew louder, more desperate, the words blending together into a cacophony of tortured, pleading cries. Jenna stumbled backward, her foot catching on a twisted root, sending her sprawling to the ground. She landed hard, the breath knocked from her lungs, the cold, damp earth pressing against her skin. She scrambled to her feet, her hands shaking, her eyes darting from shadow to shadow, the twisted branches swaying gently despite the stillness of the air. She could feel them watching her, the unseen eyes of the damned, their voices growing louder, more frantic, as if her very presence had stirred them from their eternal slumber. She turned and ran, her boots slipping on the slick, moss-covered ground, her breath coming in short, panicked bursts. The voices followed her, their desperate, mournful cries echoing through the twisted trees, growing louder, closer, with each frantic step. "Don't leave us!" She burst through the tree line, the twisted branches tearing at her clothes, scratching her skin, the cold, heavy air clinging to her like a shroud. She stumbled onto the gravel road, her boots skidding on the loose stones, her lungs burning, her heart pounding so loudly she thought it might burst. She didn't stop. She ran down the road, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her eyes wide with terror, the distant screams of the grove still ringing in her ears. She didn't stop until she reached her car, the old engine sputtering to life as she slammed her foot down on the gas, the tires kicking up gravel as she sped away from the cursed trees. Jenna never returned to the grove. She moved back to the city, far from the twisted branches and the tortured voices that still echoed in her mind. But sometimes, late at night, when the wind is still and the air grows thick and heavy, she swears she can still hear them. The whispers of the damned, their voices rising from the darkness, calling her back to the screaming grove. If you enjoyed this story, let me know in the comments below. Have you ever seen something in the woods that you couldn't explain? Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Tales Nameless for more chilling tales like this one. Until next time, stay safe and keep your lights on. Thank you for joining me tonight for these chilling tales. If you enjoyed this collection, please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Tales Nameless for more stories like these. And let me know in the comments, have you ever encountered something unexplainable in the woods? Remember, every like, share, and comment helps support the channel and keeps these stories alive. So if you have your own horror stories or have experienced something strange in the dark corners of the world, share them below. Who knows? Your story might become the next midnight tale. Until next time, stay safe and keep your lights on.